On today's podcast, I'm joined by Cody Bidlow from the ATHLETE.X YouTube channel. He has more than 15 years of experience competing in and coaching track and field and has worked with a wide variety of athletes, including those at the youth level and all the way up to Olympic sprinters during an internship with one of the most prestigious coaching institutions in the world. He's accrued over 127,000 followers across all his platforms, teaching speed training techniques and practices what he preaches. He was able to build himself up to a very impressive personal best top speed of 24.8 miles per hour at 31 years old. Cody, thank you so much for coming on. Did I get all that right?
Yeah, all sounds good. I appreciate it. For anyone wondering, I ran 1066 last year, so I'm running okay, running at my best, I would say. So, yeah, I'm just training, trying to help people as much as I can, and enjoying life in the process.
So when you're watching athletes and coaches, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see like beginner and intermediate athletes make or their coaches when it comes to their speed training?
On a coaching side, I would say, like, for example, I've been a coach of teams at the community college and the high school level. I see that a lot of people who are coaching athletes in that kind of realm are stuck in old ways of training or just ways of training that I don't think they really understand, like, what are the adaptations that we're trying to seek? And they don't really think about the SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. So when I took over, I was coaching at Arcadia High School in Phoenix before I moved back to California. And when I took over that team, all they had done previously to me being there was repeat hundreds would be a speed workout. Or, 10 times 200 or those types of workouts where they were never really getting exposed to maximal accelerations, maximal speed, not even speed endurance. It would just be plain basic fitness type work. And then the athletes would either get hurt when they go to a meet because they haven't run fast and now they go to run fast and boom, there goes my hamstring. Or they were just underperforming. By the time I was done at Arcadia, I was there for 2 seasons. Our fastest sprinter ran 1084. When I showed up, his personal best was 12.4 or 12.3.
Wow.
Now, I'm not saying that I'm the reason he went to 10.8. He had that within him. But the training that we did, which was very... it was pretty targeted as far as like our sprint days were very specific sprint days. But we only sprinted twice a week. The rest was just sort of getting the body ready for the next session. A little bit of tempo here and there, that type of thing, maybe some circuits, but nothing crazy in between those 2 main sessions. And by exposing him to, and the rest of the team, to specific forms of sprint training, we saw great improvements. We had some of the best times that the school has ever had. It didn't take like a super well thought out, periodized, every workout is perfectly planned type of approach. I would just show up. I had an idea of what I wanted to do. I knew that, okay, if they're in good shape today, we'll do this. If they're not, we'll go to this. And if they can't do that, then we'll just warm up and go home because we're not going to get anything out of today. And I approached every session like that, where I had an overall idea of where I wanted to go with the training kind of week to week. But I would base what we actually do based on how I see them when they show up to warm up. Do they look like they just came from a funeral? Or are they really excited and having a good time and smiling? Mm-hmm. If they're in a good mood, they're probably going to have a better workout. If they're fried from finals or got some social issues going on in their life or whatever, I'd make those adjustments. And so to answer your question, I think on a coaching side, there's a lack of specificity, a lack of a focus on intensity, or they may do specific training and train at an intense level, but they completely ignore recovery and, the state of readiness that the athlete is in. Because if you go to train and you're not recovered enough, not only is your performance in that session going to be worse, but more importantly, I think, your adaptability to the training won't be as good. So you won't be ready to adapt to the training. So it's kind of like you wasted a session. On an athlete side, I would say, sort of like I posted about on Instagram today, a lot of athletes I find, based on the questions that I get and things like that through YouTube, Instagram, or just people I've interacted with at track meets and athletes I've worked with, they're often looking for like a silver bullet exercise, drill, workout, or even program to make them faster. But as an athlete, if you're not working on your technique and trying to, get to a better technical model than where you're at, then it doesn't really matter the training you're doing. Second of all, I think that athletes, sort of like the magic bullet idea, they think that there's something out there, out in the ether, that's going to magically make them run faster. But really what it comes from, improving is going back to what I said about the coaching side of things. Are you doing specific training? Are you training at the intensities you need to for your event? Are you recovered enough between those intense sessions to consistently put out high quality efforts when it's time to train? And that's where you need to go to first. Focus on how your program is set up from a readiness standpoint so that when you go to the track, you can do something that's relevant to your event at the intensity you need and not get hurt. And then also while you're there, work on basic aspects of technique, like, is my posture good, or am I bent over or leaning back? Am I striking the ground in a way to where I'm not breaking every step or I'm not overstriding? Focusing on those basic things will get you way further than trying to find the flashiest exercise that looks like sprinting but really is not going to lead to any kind of adaptation. And the last thing I'll say on this point is the ultimate goal with any training session in my mind is we need to stimulate an adaptation. So the stimulus you apply through training, the stress you apply through training needs to be appropriate. So it needs to be stressful enough to cause the body to go, whoa, we need to, do something about this training that we just did. Otherwise, if the lion chases us next time, we might die. You have to think about those kind of really fundamental adaptive systems of the body. And I think people get caught up doing exercises that don't actually cause any real adaptation. So if I go to the gym, and I'm not saying everybody should squat or do a bunch of squats, but squats, I always talk about squats because squats are like a very simple thing to conceptualize. It's not because I think the squat is the best thing in the world for everybody. But if I go to the gym and I do squats, and my max is 455, but I'm only ever doing 135, I'm doing it slow, I don't have a lot of intent to move the bar fast, I'm probably not going to get anything out of it because it's just not a strong stimulus. If I want to get stronger at my squat and I go in the gym and I'm hitting, 85% for sets of 3, and I do enough to feel like, okay, I'm a little fatigued, I got something out of that session and it's probably going to help me get stronger. So on the track, you need to sprint. Don't waste a bunch of time doing all kinds of drills that are not really going to lead to any adaptation, aren't going to create a stimulus. Focus your efforts on the things that you think or know have the highest probability of benefiting you, and just keep your program simple and focus on that before you get caught up in like things that are a little bit too experimental or esoteric or just kind of like junk training volume. And we can get into that, more with more questions that you have, and I don't want to ramble too much, but that's the gist of things that I think people need to be thinking about either as coaches or athletes when it comes to running faster.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. There's something I noticed a lot with the athletes on my college team before I graduated, and it seems like everyone is either on one side or the other. There's the one side, the people that don't want to do work at all, and so they barely show up, they barely want to try. And then there's the people that care, and they're influenced by like the grind mindset culture. Yeah. And so they do way too much and blow themselves up. And I've been there like 150 times. I do that all the time, and I struggle to learn from my mistakes there, especially when I'm coaching myself. It's so easy to throw too much on yourself because you want to experiment and everything. But yeah, that's something I've noticed. I was going to ask, so you said you sprinted your high school athletes twice a week. Was that usually like one acceleration focus day and one max speed focus day on average?
Approximately. So early in the year, it would be mostly acceleration oriented and then some tempo. We might do some jumping or other things to expose the body to more like rapid ground contacts or just to get the body ready to handle sprinting. And then with short sprinters, I follow a short to long approach. So the accelerations will get a little longer. Maybe they started at 10s the first day, but then once we're in the, kind of the meat of the season, like it'll shift to maybe where they're doing 30s from blocks. And then the speed work might have started at flying 10s or 40-meter sprints from a drop-in start or something like that, to where later in the season we're doing 70-meter sprints. I would always keep the workload limited to where once I started to see them either slow down significantly in a rep, their technique starts to get a little wonky, or they're taking a really long time to recover, then I would shut the session down. Because my view is, for most athletes, once you've hit your fastest rep of the day, I don't know how much more you're going to benefit from then doing like slower, lower quality reps after that once fatigue is set in, especially when it comes to speed itself. Mm-hmm. Acceleration, because you're not reaching max velocity in most of those workouts, it may be less of a concern. With raw endurance type of training, okay, you want to create fatigue because we're trying to improve endurance and the resistance to fatigue, so you can get it, you can work under fatigue more in that realm. But when it comes to actually trying to develop speed itself, like maximal velocity sprinting, the goal is to reach the fastest you can run, and then that's pretty much it. Maybe we would do one rep if you ran a really fast time. Maybe we'd do one more if everyone's feeling really good. We have enough days before the next meet or the next session, and I feel like it's safe and nobody's going to get hurt. Okay, we might do one more. But you want to run fast and then shut it down, because I want the body to remember the highest quality output that the athlete can produce. I don't want it to remember 95% of that. So that's kind of how I would approach it. Now, once we got into the season itself, the meet would then be the main workout of the week. And I would just cycle through depending on what I felt was most appropriate for what they needed to work on. So maybe their starts are really what's holding them back. So maybe earlier in that week we'll do starts. With someone else, maybe it's their, ability to maintain top speed and they fall apart technically. Okay, maybe we'll do some things working on that earlier in the week. And I would just try to pair the work that they need, so that way when they get to the meet, they've worked on that thing that they need to get better at, and then we can see, were they able to express that ability in the meet that week. So if you're coaching athletes, always consider the meet is the main workout. That's where you're going to get the biggest stimulus, the most adaptation. Like, that's the most intense thing they can do. So build the week around that. I would have athletes come to me from other high schools for training, like on the weekends or that sort of thing. And most of the time when they were underperforming, they were doing crazy workouts in the day or two before the meet. And it just never made sense to me, because then you show up to the meet and you're fried and you have no chance of running fast, So I would do that, more acceleration focused workout, and then either a short speed endurance, maybe later in the year, a little bit of true speed endurance work. But if we're going to run 100, a 200, and a 4x1 on Saturday, do I really need to do speed endurance on Monday? No, because that's going to be taken care of by the meet. I'd rather do acceleration or speed. So I try to keep that in mind of what are they going to get out of the meet, then fill the gaps in the rest of the week and do it at a level where I know they're going to be recovered by the time they need to perform.
When it comes to your lifting, I feel like there's sort of two different perspectives on that. Mm-hmm. You have the people that will do like a Monday sprint, for example, and then a Tuesday lift. Mm-hmm. And then you also have, I think, the Charlie Francis approach, where you do like a high and then a low nervous system day.
Yeah.
And that's also, I don't know if you know who Paul Favorites is, PJM Performance. Yeah. I think he follows that a lot. He'll do high, low, high, low. Yeah. I lean toward high, low, but I don't know if there's a concern in terms of like you do a sprint workout and then you're doing some sort of slower, heavier lifting. Like you said, you want to end off on your fastest sprint. I don't know if there's some concern where you do a really fast sprint and then you're moving really slow in the weight room. Like maybe there'd be some issues in settling in the adaptations there. I'm just curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, that's something I've thought about a lot over time. I've gravitated toward sprint day 1, lift day 2, off or low intensity day 3. Day 4 could be off or go back to another sprint day. So like sprint lift off or sprint lift off, and then repeat. Part of that is because unless you're in a situation where you're at a school where, you have like the gym is right next to the track and logistically it's easy to go from the track to the gym in that same session. If there's a huge gap in time because you got to drive across town to the gym, it just takes too much of your day to do 2 sessions in one day. it's also more to recover from in that day. So there's some recovery issues that I could see you running into if you're always doing, sprinting and lifting on the same day. But then also that point that you sort of alluded to, which is, say I'm doing max velocity. Okay, I go and I run, I don't know, a fast flying 30 time. Well, I've told my body that's what I want to adapt to. But like you said, if I then go do some slow, heavy lifting, maybe I stimulated some really, the most fast twitch muscle fibers in that sprint session. But then I go and I lift in like an arduous, grinding, heavy lift. Now I'm telling my body something different. And so I would rather give my body one main type of stimulus per day and then let that take hold and body starts to, recover from that, and then come back the next day and lift. It doesn't mean you can never do both in the same day. I still will do that sometimes. If I have a lot of energy one day and I don't have anything going on, maybe I will go to the gym after. But for me, I find that it's easier to consistently recover from training if those sessions are separated. Now, if you're dealing with high schoolers who they're pretty adaptable, they have a lot of energy, it makes more sense, especially since the gym is right there at the school. Do your sprints, go lift, great. But if we're getting to a point in the season where we really need to be performing well, once again, I would think about, is that going to be too much load for them to recover from if we're doing 2 workouts in one day? I'll caveat this by saying we barely did any lifting when I was coaching the high schoolers. I just felt like that wasn't the limiting factor for most of the athletes. Most of them needed to learn how to sprint. They needed to get exposed to sprinting. So we would lift kind of earlier in the year. Later in the year, we might go in once every 7 to 10 days and just do some kind of work, whether that's trying to, heal up an injury someone's dealing with. Maybe they have their knee bugs them because they had an injury a long time ago in soccer or something. All right, we might need to do something there to try to alleviate the pain or strengthen an area. But for the most part, I let sprinting deal with like the bulk of the training. And lifting was really an afterthought. And that might seem funny because I lift a lot. I like lifting personally. But you have to look at the population you're dealing with and think to yourself, is that the main thing that they need? And then within that, if you look at their entire life schedule, like if you're a post-collegiate athlete and you have a job, maybe you have family, you have friends, you have social obligations, you only have so much time in the day. So I think the best training program is the one that fits within the overall life schedule and the aggregate stress load of that athlete. I don't believe that there is one specific framework of either high-low or sprint lift off or whatever setup you come up with. I don't think there's any one that is objectively the best. It really depends on the logistics, like how far do you have to drive across town to go from the track to the gym, and how much time does that take up? Do you have that time available to you, and can you recover from that?
Okay, gotcha. So what kind of stuff were you looking at to determine that like the high schoolers didn't need much lifting? Because I ran my fastest ever in a period where I wasn't lifting at all, and then I promptly turned around and blew myself up by doing too much. So disappointing there. But
same here.
So I'm curious what stuff you're looking at to determine that.
It's just sort of a feel type of thing. And also, like the sprinters that I had, most of them, especially on the guys' side, they like to lift on their own. So like when we weren't, prior to when I showed up, they were already doing stuff in the gym. So once we got into the gym, I could see, okay, they're strong enough for their current level of development to where I don't think that like if we increase their squat by 50 pounds, is that going to be the difference? Especially considering the fatigue associated with what it's going to take to do that. And the other thing with high school is you often get athletes like 1 month before season starts. So you'd better be really focused on the specific training more than anything. And so it was more just a gut feeling. As you are around enough athletes for long enough, you can start to just see things without doing a bunch of testing or whatever. I'm sure some people would say that's not the way to approach it, but that's just how I am. I'm more of an intuitive type of coach, I would say. And so I just looked at the athletes and thought, well, all right, they already have a history of lifting. None of them are super weak when we did lift. So I thought, well, I'll just spend more of my time on the sprinting side of things, come into the gym periodically, and then as we get closer to needing to compete, just kind of let that be. We would still do things like med ball throws or some resisted sprinting, some things like that, which I think can help kind of keep you in touch with force outputs without having to spend too much time in the gym if there's already a base of strength developed there. Now, there were plenty of athletes who I'm sure could have benefited, but that's the other issue is if you have a huge track team, if you have like 90 kids and your gym isn't very big, like, what are you going to do? You know, how do you get an effective workout with all these kids who are having trouble focusing and you can't watch everybody and is someone going to get hurt, blah, blah, blah. So for the kids who did not have a history of lifting, they would do more general strength circuits on their off days. So maybe they're doing squats, you know, standing good mornings or lunges or things like that, some jumps. That's where their strength training really came from, was just teaching them how to move properly, loading them with body weight or med balls or bands. And then for the kids who were more developed, I would take them into the gym, but just not super frequently. And I cut it out once we were into the most important part of the season.
So what things are you doing differently when you're training somebody who's a beginner compared to an elite athlete? Other than, obviously, I mean, we're talking about not doing lifting for certain individuals, but like what other things are you looking at doing differently?
I would say, you know, first of all, with someone who is new to sprinting, you just have to keep it really basic. And I think you can keep it basic either way. But I just wouldn't overthink it. Like, if someone's not used to sprinting, they need to get used to sprinting. Probably going to start with some acceleration work because they're going to be, you know, least likely to get hurt because the velocities aren't crazy. It would be more of a focus on learning the technical model rather than really trying to load the athlete. So it's more of like, with the beginner athlete, there's a lot more teaching involved. And I'm thinking less about the loading of the program, like I need to do this much work in order for them to get better. Like they really don't need to do that much. They just need to learn how to do it right. Mm-hmm. So much of the time would be focused on technique and then just like really basic forms of sprint training, like an acceleration day, some speed work, some tempo, and then enough recovery so they don't get hurt. With athletes who have a high training age, whether they're elite or non-elite, but if they've been training a long time, you know, you become resistant to adapting to training the more you do it. And the more you do the same type of training, the less you adapt to it. It's, you know, accommodation. So I think with someone with a higher training age, that's where you might want to think more about, like, how do I manipulate what we're doing on the track so we're still working toward the same goal, but we're throwing something slightly different at the athlete. So maybe that's where wearable resistance comes into play. Or maybe I would do more like just things to where I'm trying to slightly change the stimulus enough so it feels a little different, but we're not so far off from the main goal that we're doing something completely different. So that's why I say wearable resistance. You can run pretty fast with, you know, 200 grams of weights strapped to your thighs, but it feels a little different than sprinting without it. So that might be one way to like nudge the body toward giving it something that's different enough so it wants to adapt. Whereas with the freshman high schooler who can barely stand up straight while he's sprinting, he just needs to sprint, you know? He probably doesn't need to pull sleds. He probably can't even pull a sled effectively, you know? Once you are good at accelerating, now you can accelerate with some load. Maybe you'll get a little bit more out of resisted sprints from that. But I don't think that things change like in a massive way. It's just you have to be a little more creative when, like, if you've reached really close to the best that you're ever going to perform at, you run into the problem of I have to do more of the specific training in order to get better. But there's a limit on how much specific training you can do. You can only sprint so much before you get hurt. So if you have a high training age, I think that's where things like the stuff I do in the gym, where it's like almost like plyometric forms of lifting, where you're really working on rapid, short duration rate of force development. Things like that I would use more with someone who has a high training age. I wouldn't use that with someone who has a low training age. So for example, my online training group, most of those athletes have not been training as long as I have, or all of them haven't. So they're doing more general strength work in the gym than I do, because I have a long history of doing strength work. Like you commented on my post the other day, I box squatted 505. I haven't been working up to that. I just was able to do that. I've been doing back squats and other things, but I hadn't done an 18-inch box squat in a long time. But I did 505 without much. It wasn't that hard. Why? Because I have that base of strength. I'm going to maintain that base of strength. So I need to do other things rather than just spam max strength. I need to maintain my max strength, but improve my ability to produce force in short time frames. Those are the things that I would think about off the track with those athletes who have a higher training age. And then also just, I would say, generally speaking, much more intensified training and a much more a greater focus on intensity the higher your training age. The lower your training age, the less you have to be like neurotic about, not that you should be neurotic anyways, but like you don't have to neurotically focus on intensity. They just need to sprint pretty fast, recover, and come back and sprint pretty fast again, and they're going to get better. With the athletes with a high training age, you need to be very particular about how much general training are we doing, and is that going to take away from our ability to produce intensity in our next session, or is it going to dilute the stimulus within that session? And I think you have to be more particular about the intensities you incorporate into the training, and then also think about the time constraints of the event. How much time do you have to produce force while you're on the ground? If you have a high training age and a high base of strength, probably need to shift more to that stuff than just spamming max strength all the time.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to progressing someone from the simpler types of training to the more advanced stuff, are you just looking at when they stop improving or slow down their improvement? Is that what you use to judge when you should make things more complex?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely part of it. So like from a quantitative standpoint, yeah, you can look at times, or say I have an athlete who, all right, we're doing deep squats for a cycle or 2 cycles or something like that of training. If they really start to stagnate to where I tell them, okay, I want you to work up to a heavy single or a heavy double on squats, and 3 sessions in a row, they're like basically at the same weight, maybe it goes up 5 or 10 pounds, but the bar is not moving much faster, or it just doesn't seem like it's improving that much. Okay, I'm going to switch the stimulus to something else, because we can always go back to that later if we want, but I don't want to waste time, bashing your head into the wall trying to get better at this general form of training. The more you do it, the less, as you do something more and more, you're going to get less and less out of it over time. So I look at things like that. If their times are stagnating, something needs to change. So then I'll get to thinking about what needs to change for that athlete. Qualitatively, it's kind of the same thing, where you can look at an athlete and see, okay, his strength work looks good, but when he goes to do some kind of like stiffness oriented hop, it's not really there. Like they don't have that reactivity. If I see that they're lacking reactivity, and I think they can shift toward doing reactive training without getting hurt, and they have that base of strength, I'm going to shift toward that. So, I think you can combine the qualitative and the quantitative to say this objective measure, like a time or a number in the gym or something like that, you can rely on that. But then you also need to look at it qualitatively and think, how does this athlete look when they sprint? Maybe they're really strong, but they look like trash at top speed. Clearly, we need to focus less on the max strength, and we need to focus on something else. So I try to combine the objective and the subjective data. And I think that's kind of the art of coaching, is just you have to be able to look at someone and get a sense for where can we try to go with training to continue to spur some adaptation if things have started to stagnate. But to answer your question, generally, yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay. So you mentioned, similarly to me, you've blown yourself up a few times by doing too much too fast.
Yep.
Have you learned anything more recently on how to regulate that? Because like what I've been thinking about is, this is another thing I heard a lot from Paul Favorites. He talks about just going up in really small, like 5% increments in terms of volume or intensity. And he's like, the human body is incredibly adaptable. It can do all kinds of crazy stuff if you give yourself enough time. And that's, people get in a hurry and they don't give themselves the time. So anyway, I'm curious if there's anything recently you've been thinking about.
Yeah, I think for one, volume is one of those things where it probably should ramp up over time. But anytime that I've dramatically ramped up volume, or I bring up volume and then I maintain that volume for a while without dipping back down, I tend to get hurt in one way or another, whether it's a chronic issue like tendon pain or it's an acute injury like straining a muscle. So it goes back to that concept of intensity and specificity. Like, I want to progress intensity over everything because in the 100, the ultimate goal is to reach a higher level of intensity. Really, like that's what you're after. So I would much rather say I reach a certain point in volume. Like, for example, I've strained some muscle in my like rib cage, back, oblique, kind of like that whole area, maybe 2 months ago or something like that. And I was like, this is really odd. I don't know why, blah, 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 why this happened. I don't know if I could have really prevented it. But then I looked back at my training and I chart out like my volume each day of sprinting. Sure enough, right before I got hurt, my volume went like this. It went way up. I went from like an average of 240 meters per session to like 340 to 400 meters per session of fast sprinting. So avoiding those rapid changes in loading is a big factor. I also think that, for example, like, people think about exercise in the gym, like say hamstring curls or some other exercise. Okay, I want to do this to strengthen the hamstrings. But if I'm not used to doing that exercise, the amount of soreness, muscle tissue breakdown, like the tension that's going to be there for the next few days, that's all going to be much higher if I haven't done that exercise in a while. So you also have to be really careful about anytime you introduce something new to the program, as far as an exercise. I think if you go too intense too quickly with it, that's another way to get yourself hurt. So I've had many times where I think to myself, my hamstrings are weak, I need to do hamstring training. I do hamstring training, and then I hurt my hamstring within a week or two. You would think, I need to do Nordics to get stronger hamstrings. But by breaking down your hamstrings, by doing the Nordics, you're now at a higher risk of injury. So it gets tricky. And I think if you're in a period of time where you're really focused on sprinting fast, that's where you need to be really careful about those increases in volume or the changes in your exercise selection. And that could be volume for the session itself or volume per rep. Like you probably wouldn't want to go from doing a bulk of your training between like 30 and 60 meters and then hop into an all-out 300 because you're not prepared for that and something's going to probably go wrong. If you incrementally worked up, okay, you were doing 80s and then 100s, 120s, 150s, 180s, 200s, 250s, and now you can do a 300 no problem. But if you have a drastic change in any of those factors, exercise selection, the distance you're running, the speed you're running the rep at, the amount of, volume in the gym, total session volume on the track, frequency, that's another thing. Typically when I've gotten hurt is when I've ramped up to where I'm doing like 3 intense sessions in a row. I can do 2 intense sessions in a row regularly and be fine. But if I go to 3, now my injury risk is going to go up. So you have to be careful about when you're changing the stress that's being applied to the athlete. You really have to think, like, what is the cost that's associated with this? And if you can think forward a little bit as you're writing a program or putting together your training, you can kind of see this is what will happen. But in the moment, I want to do this because of this reason, and you kind of forget about the cost that you're going to have to pay or the price you're going to have to pay. And I think that's where people tend to go wrong. At least that's where I've gone wrong in the past.
Yeah, I've been there too, plenty of times.
Yep.
So I'm curious, how do you approach sprint training for a 100-meter runner compared to a 400-meter runner?
For short sprints, definitely I follow a short to long program. Where I've gone wrong in the past is staying too short for too long. So there were periods of time where I never ran farther than 60 meters in training. Sometimes even no further than 50 meters in training. And I would get faster up into a certain point, and then I would just stagnate. So you definitely want to progress up to the longer sprints, and long could mean a 90 for someone. If someone's super muscular and is a really power type sprinter, are you going to be able to run them through fast 200s? Probably not. They're probably just going to get beaten up by the turn, and the cost of training is too high. But you still want to progress up to close to that specific distance, a little bit below and a little bit above their main event, so they're getting exposed to what they need to do in their event. So both the intense training, like the speed work, acceleration work, all that stuff, goes from short to long, and the tempo goes from short to long. Maybe you start at 90s, and maybe by the end of the season you're doing 250s or 300s for your tempo. Maybe you're doing 150s, depends on the athlete. But we build up short to long. With 400-meter athletes, I think the ends to middle approach works better. So you do a short to long progression with your speed work. Start with acceleration, get into speed, short speed endurance, regular speed endurance, special endurance, and you progress that way. But with the tempo, you start long and you move to short. Not even short, but long to moderate. Because the 400, there's a couple factors. One, mentally, you need to know that you can run the whole distance. Anytime I've run a 400, which hasn't been, I ran one 400 in competition, indoors. It's pretty long. If you're not used to doing it, it's a long ways to go. So I think you need to get yourself used to simply running. This is Puffs, by the way. Hello, everybody. You need to get used to running the distance itself, and I think beyond. So maybe you're starting the year with 600s for your tempo, or 550s, or 500s. And then you can bring that down. As the intense sprinting gets longer, the low intense work on the track can get shorter. So that way you're kind of reducing the volume, reducing the number of contacts, allowing them to recover more for those more important sessions. But you go from short to long with the speed work, long to moderate with the low intensity running. And I think that works best for most 400 athletes. I think with a short to long approach, it's too easy to get stuck never covering the distances you need to run the 400 without dying. And also I find that it's I don't know, it's just hard to manage the load. And when I think about training, I think load management is one of the more important things you have to consider. And if everything is ramping up in distance at the same time, your tempo is getting longer and your fast sprinting is getting longer, I feel like it exposes you to some risk from an injury standpoint and just getting burnt out. Whereas if while you're doing the really short speed work, you're getting your body used to running 500, 600 meters, or if you're doing timed runs, maybe you're doing 90-second runs or something like that. And then you've built up that ability to just go the distance. And now we just make, going the distance now becomes faster, and we reduce the volume of the tempo work to allow for the intensification and the increased volume that they'll be doing in the faster work.
Okay, so I've got two follow-ups about tempo. So what days would you typically do tempo? Because for me, what I'm thinking about doing is it'd be sprinting and lifting on Monday, which I know isn't quite what you'd always go for, but yeah, and then a low intensity day on Tuesday that would have tempo in it. I don't know if you would do that, or if you would do a sprint lift off, and then on Saturday come in and do the tempo, or what generally you would tend toward.
It probably depends a lot on the athlete themselves, because some athletes can handle a lot of tempo and they don't get Achilles tendonitis, or they don't get shin splints or things like that. So with an athlete who is very resilient as far as the volume side of things at low intensities, I would have no problem with doing like sprint lift on Monday, tempo the next day, and then maybe an off day following that. If I had athletes who were more, he really wants to be involved.
Yeah.
If I had athletes who maybe they don't handle the volume very well, that's when I would separate it to like that Saturday session or something like that. Like we get our speed work, our speed endurance stuff, whatever the intense training is, we get that during the week and then finish off the week with something more tempo oriented. Now, earlier on in the year, I think you can do tempo more often because if you're doing the ends to middle approach and the first few weeks of training you're just doing acceleration work and tempo, you could probably do, if you're doing 30-meter sprints or 20-meter sprints for your acceleration work, you should have no problem the next day coming out and doing a tempo session. But if you were out there running, maybe you did 3x150 all out, do I really want to come back the next day and run repeat 400s? No, like it's too much, So I would try to pair it to what can the athlete actually do consistently over a long period of time without getting hurt, and try to pair the weekly training setup with that. You could have the concept of I need to do X amount of tempo each week, or I need X amount of sessions for this and that type of work, but that's just concepts. You have to deal with the reality of the athlete and the situation that is in front of you. And, I had sprinters on the team who one would kill the tempo session, like no problem, and the other would die completely. So the guy who dies, then they run basically the same 100 time or 200 time or 400 time. Well, the guy who gets totally obliterated by tempo, I got to find something else for him to do. Maybe he only does tempo once a week instead of twice a week like the other guys. But then I find something else that can be still conditioning for him, but is not going to beat him up as much, I really would always come back to that of what can they actually handle repeatedly over time and give them that rather than some concept of, God sent down that you need to have this many sessions at this distance. Like, I don't think those rules exist so much. I think a lot of this is something that I don't know if people always consider, but like most of the great coaches, when they're in a coaching situation, they're doing that. They're working with what's in front of them. Over time, they develop best practices and, sort of principles of training that are generally true. But just because they say this is how you should train doesn't necessarily mean that's how they did it every single session all the time. Like they had to make adjustments. So you have to make adjustments based on the population you're working with, the athlete in front of you, or yourself, and be really realistic about what the athlete can handle long term.
Okay. When it comes to your tempo work in terms of intensities, are you ever doing like hard tempo work? I mean, I guess, so usually I hear tempo work's like 60 to 70% effort. And so over 400 or 600 meters or something, I guess that probably would get kind of hard, but are you ever having the athletes push it higher, like 85% or something like that with 400 guys specifically?
I think it's more applicable to the 400 than the short sprints. In the short sprints, I would use it as a bridge to like get them used to the distances they're going to be doing speed endurance work at. So it wouldn't take up a long period of time in the overall yearly, training plan, but I would do it to bridge the gap. Like say you've been doing acceleration and speed work, so you haven't gone over like 50 meters in training, but you've been doing extensive tempo where you've been running 150s or 200s or something like that. I would then bridge the gap between that tempo work and the speed endurance work by doing intensive tempo. So the 80, 85, maybe touching on 90% range, just to get them used to covering that distance at a higher intensity level. So then when I say, all right, it's time to go 95, 100% on this workout, they can do it at a high enough quality level that it's not just a waste of a session and they don't get hurt. I think with 400 athletes, it makes more sense to do it more often and for a longer part of the year. But you can't treat it like an extensive tempo session thinking, all right, the next day I can come back and be at my best, because it's quite fatiguing. So you have to view it as a high intensity session, even if it's not maximal. And that's where I think some people maybe go wrong is, well, this is a tempo session. It's intensive tempo, so I can come back the next day and do something intense. I don't know. I think it is pretty harsh on the body if you do a lot of it. So I would use it with 400 athletes. Sort of like, just like I would bridge the gap between the distance they were doing in extensive tempo to the speed endurance stuff with short sprinters. You could do the same thing with a 400 meter athlete. It's just the distances are longer, so maybe they're running 300s at 85%, and then that sets them up to now do 300s at 90%, That's kind of how I would approach it. The ultimate goal is to get to doing, 300, 320, 350 at race pace. But if I can't do that at race pace with quality, then I need to do that slightly below race pace and try to bring that up over time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. With your 4 guys, well, every time I've been in a program, even I used to be a distance runner, and all through distance running and then up into being a 400 runner now, I've always done 200 repeats, 200 meter repeats. Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking about it more recently and looking a lot at the research. And it's like, generally 400 meter performance is predicted by max velocity, then peak blood lactate amounts, and then your performance while under a certain blood lactate level. So almost like acid tolerance is maybe the best way to put that. And as I've been thinking about it recently, I feel like the classic workout of like 4 or 5 200s just leans a little more in the direction of an 800 runner, because they have so much time, which is what I used to do. So I've felt that quite a few times, but they have so much time that it becomes relevant for them to like clear the acid out of themselves as they're still performing. Mm-hmm. I feel like what I've felt as a 400 runner is you don't really have time to do any clearing. I don't know if I'm scientifically correct in saying that, but intuitively that's what it feels like. Mm-hmm. And that's what I feel like the 200 sessions teach you, is they teach you how to keep moving while clearing this acid out of your muscles. Yeah. What's your take on that? And do you perform like classic 200s with your athletes?
I didn't do a lot of it, I would say. I tended to be more like, let's do less reps and I'd rather get used to covering the distance you need to cover rather than just spamming a bunch of reps to get like a total session volume in. So I don't know. It's tough for me to say, really. I think you can have success either way you go, but I found that like if athletes just do a bunch of 200s, I didn't see it transfer that much to the 400, I guess is the best way to put it. So maybe it's because of what you're saying. Maybe it's some other factor. But I don't think that that's like a magic bullet workout. I think that's great to have in there along the progression, Like, yes, you should run some 200s and then build up from there. But I don't know, I've done a lot of those workouts too, and my 400 always sucked. So I can't say that it helped that much, I would rather do less reps, but do 300s or something, and maybe a little more rest in between. So you can work on like not that you're necessarily going to be going at the pace of the workout or the pace of the race in the workout, but like wrapping your mind around how you run the race, like race modeling is a huge part of being an effective track athlete. And if you don't get the opportunity to work on that, whether it's at race pace or below in your training, and the only time you do it is at a meet when the stress is high and it's hard to focus, you're probably not going to get as good of results versus if you were working that within your training. So when I think of the 400, yes, you have to consider the biochemical, physiological side of the equation, but I also think there's a mental side that has to be developed of like, this is how I progress through the distance, And if you're running a 300, well, the last 100, you just got to hang on. So I can sort of say we're doing, I don't know, intensive tempo with 300s. You can still work on, okay, I need to get out strong, maintain on the back stretch, start to kind of build up coming off that second turn, that sort of thing. And I feel like you would get more out of that than just 10 by 200 with 30 seconds rest or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And even like you're saying, in terms of the confidence aspect, like when you run a 300 and it's fast and it feels good and you're not dead at the end, that does so much more for you than, oh yeah, I just scraped by my sixth 200 at sub
exactly.
25 pace.
Yeah, totally.
How much attention do you pay, maybe not with your athletes, but in your own training, to like your body composition and like your weight and stuff? I think it was sort of recently you were trying to cut some weight and seemed like you had some success there. And it's like with my own training, I put on a lot of weight since I stopped distance running, as you can imagine. I'm like 25 pounds heavier than I was. And I look at my weight and then I look at guys like Noah Lyles and Wade Van Niekerk, who are obviously inspirations of mine, you know?
Yeah, of course.
And it's like, they're light. I mean, Lyles is maybe 165 at his heaviest, and Wade Van Niekerk's even lighter. He's 155. But obviously that brings up the discussion of like, well, maybe they're elastic-focused athletes as opposed to power and that kind of thing. So I'm just curious, how much weight do you place on that? And like, do you think it's really important, or is it more so just staying relatively lean and healthy?
I would say most of the year, just stay relatively lean and healthy, because the issue I ran into when I was trying to cut weight significantly was my recovery was so bad that like I would get sore from just simply doing a warm-up session, because I was eating like 0 carbs basically. And it was also just tough mentally because I would like stress out about what I was eating, and I don't know. It's just, at a certain point you have to ask yourself like, okay, is this like a net positive in my life and for my performance, you know? But I do think that, or I know, I will run faster at 180 than I will at 200 pounds. There's no doubt in my mind that that's the case. Will I run faster at 160 than 180? Probably not, because the cost I'm going to pay physically, hormonally, mentally, by going from 180 to 160, that loss of weight is not going to offset the loss in strength, the loss in energy, and that sort of thing. So there's a range where you want to be on the low end of a weight range that is reasonable for you to achieve while still maintaining good dietary habits and being able to train and recover. I would always try to be on the low end of that as you want to be at your best and prior to that, because I think if you lose weight too quickly, your performance does not immediately improve, because say you've been training at, like I've been 185 to 190-ish for a while. If I just magically drop 20 pounds, my body is used to the rhythm and the, like how, if you think of your body as a spring, like how much that spring gets loaded while on the ground. There's factors that are kind of hard to explain, but I just intuitively feel your body gets used to being at a certain weight. So you can perform well at this weight or this weight. But if you drop from this weight to this weight too quickly, or you do it right when you need to perform well, you may not see those performance benefits. Whereas if you gradually get down there and then you hang out there for months, now you're going to be able to reap the benefits of being lighter, because you'll probably regain some of that strength you lost. You'll get used to the coordination of maybe your leg swings through quicker because your leg isn't as heavy. And so you kind of get used to the rhythm and the technique that is associated with that lighter weight. So I would definitely say try to shift toward being light, but do it far enough away from competition to where you're not now relearning things at this new weight when it counts. Learn that in training, both the physical performance side of things, the technique, as well as like learning how to eat and live your daily life at that weight, so you can get used to that, and then you enter competition at a weight that you've been used to for a while. I think that's the way to approach it. So yes, be lean, as lean as you can without sacrificing your recovery, but don't try to cut weight like 2 weeks before the season. You know, try to do that further away so you're used to it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's something I've felt like is pretty genetically predetermined, which like you get the people that are like, all that matters is calories in, calories out for weight. Right. And I know that scientifically, like, you know, there's the law of thermodynamics and everything, but at the same time, like those guys are clearly naturally low body fat percentage. Like they're that way year round. They're not suffering daily, you know, to stay at that percentage. And like, I personally realized I was under eating significantly a few months ago now, and I upped my daily calories by 1,000 because I count everything, so I knew where I was. I literally went from like 2,500 to 3,500 overnight. I put on 5 pounds in 3 days and then stopped.
Yeah.
And it's like by all the laws of the science of calories, I should be getting fat right now. I should be up to like 200 pounds, but it's just like it was a little bump and then it just froze right there.
And you probably felt better, training and just better in general, because you're not starved. I also think that it's hard to compare because if I look at a guy like Noah Lyles, I believe that his bones are probably lighter than mine. So like my skeletal frame is probably heavier than his. So even if I probably look more bulky than him, but even if we were kind of similar, I feel like the proportion of his weight that was like muscle and connective tissue would be higher than mine if I was at that weight. So it's hard to compare to other athletes because our physiology is all different. So that's why I say there's a range for you personally that you can kind of hang out in without totally starving yourself or totally overeating, and just try to shift to the low end of that. And periodically, maybe you do experiment trying to go even lower, but for the vast majority of people, I think they will get faster as they lose weight up into a certain point, and then there will be side effects of that make it not worth trying to go lighter, And for me, that's probably 175 pounds.
And are you 6 feet or 6'1"?
Like 5'11" and 3/4.
Oh, okay.
So.
See, me too, but I call that 6 feet.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah. That's funny. We're actually pretty similar weights then. I'm 175 right now.
Okay. Yeah.
But I wonder if my bones are dense because I'm definitely not as built as you are. So I don't know where that extra weight's coming from.
Yeah. That's like the thing. That's why I wonder about that, because I see people who I'm like, I don't know. I don't feel like I'm that much bigger than you, but I'm definitely heavier than you. And I'm not like, I don't feel fat, I can see my abs and everything. So
yeah,
I don't know what's going on, but who knows?
So you ran that fastest ever speed at 31, which is absolutely nuts. Most people, I think in general, are peaking around like 22 to 26 in the sprint range. I think maybe going a little higher in recent years. I'm not positive, but I'm curious, what sort of things were you doing to accomplish that? I know you were working a lot with like the velocity-based training and that kind of stuff. I'd love to hear about the steps you took in that progression, and also what time period that was over. I don't know if was that like a year cycle that led up to that, or like what was the deal?
Let's see. Well, that was actually a unique period because I had a significant injury, so I was like pretty fresh as far as like from a training standpoint. I did have some pain that I was dealing with, so I had to work around that, which limited the amount of volume that I could do. So I found that doing less training tends to equate to better performances. Just because if you become like chronically fatigued or you always have aches and pains you're dealing with, the likelihood of you performing well is going to be very low, So a lot of it came from not overdoing the amount of training I was doing. And then for me, focusing on like sprint zones where I have enough exposure to max velocity. Like I don't think if I just did 10-meter flies, I would improve. Like I need to be exposed to speed for a longer period, like doing 70s, maybe a 30-meter acceleration into a flying 40. Like that's the type of work for me that I feel is pretty effective. And I was doing stuff like that, plus working on in the gym very rapid, short rate of force development timeframes. That was probably the biggest change, aside from not overdoing it on the volume side or the training frequency side. Giving myself enough time to recover in between sessions makes a big difference. So those played a role, I would say, for actually running faster in a meet this past season where I set my personal best. My training was extremely specific. I would take sometimes like 3 or 4 days off in between sessions. I didn't lift at all. So like the only signal I was sending to my body was run as fast as you can for a distance that is relevant to your event. And most sessions would be like one main effort of the session, and everything else was just to get me up to that main part of the workout. So that's why I say, like, the preconceived notions about how much work you have to do, a lot of that is influenced by programs where guys were on steroids or like things like that, to where the amount of work they were doing was something that normal people cannot handle. And so if someone is in a situation where they've been training a long time and they're not improving, you have to prioritize intensity. But the trade-off is you can only go super intense so often, so you have to train less often. And also not clutter your program with too much general training to where you're fatiguing yourself, but you're not really getting anything out of it. So the further you are in your progression and the further you are in your development, the more training years you have under your belt, it can be uncomfortable, but sometimes you have to train less because that allows you to then train at a higher intensity level. So that way, what you're adapting to is the intensity side of the equation, not the number of sprints or the number of sessions per week.
And I wonder, so like, it's funny, it almost seems like early in an athlete's career, they kind of want to not necessarily avoid the weight room, but, really put the first thing first, emphasize sprinting. And then also, like in your case, later on in your career, you can do the same thing.
Yeah.
I wonder if you hadn't had the foundation.
It's like a bell curve,
For sure. I wonder if you hadn't had so much time in the weight room, if you still would have had those adaptations on the track after you pulled back the weight room.
Yeah,
I'm assuming not, right?
Have. Yeah, I think you're correct. Like, for example, last winter, I wasn't able to sprint very consistently because the injury I had in early 2023 took me like 5 or 6 months to recover from. But then once I reintroduced training, I ramped up volume too quickly, and it turned into just a chronic pain situation I was in, where I was in pain, whether I was laying in bed, walking around, working out, like I was just always dealing with pain. So I couldn't sprint very often because that would aggravate it. So I lifted a lot. I think I box squatted 520 for like 3 reps or 4 reps.
Wow.
I hex bar deadlifted 660. I snatched 242 hang snatch. So I was strong, but I was bulky. Because I had that base of strength and I didn't lift from like February until July, I came back and was able to deep squat 365 without a single squat session for like 8 months or something. Because even when I was still lifting, I dropped squats out of the program. So I maintained strength that whole time just by sprinting, doing some plyos and things like that, where had I not done all that strength work, I wouldn't have that strength to maintain, and I probably wouldn't have seen the same results realistically. So I think you can drop strength out of the equation for a long time and like really not lose. You might even gain. But if you don't have the strength to begin with, then I don't think it's going to work out quite the same way.
That makes a lot of sense. Something I've thought about a lot is the differentiators between the elites and the non-elites. So a good example that I think about pretty frequently is there was a guy on my college team who, for one, didn't train like 8 months out of the year, which is ridiculous. But then so he came in and he hated the weight room. He'd barely want to touch it. I was, if I remember right, stronger than him in like every lift pretty much. Mm-hmm. And even the explosive lifts, it seemed like I would outperform him and do it with more weight and everything. And of course, I bet you can see where this is going. We go out on the track and he'd smoke me any day.
Yeah.
And he ended up running like a wind assisted 10.6, something like that at our conference meet. And it's so confusing to try to think through what is causing those differences. So like my best guess, he played basketball for years, and his whole 8 months not training, he was just playing basketball, training basketball. And so I assume it's a massive amount of elasticity built up from a ton of low level ground contacts. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious, what are your take? What do you think are the differentiators?
Definitely. I mean, there's like the physical side. So like the physical qualities that someone has, which some of them are innate. You can't change your tendon insertions. Like, what do you do? Cut it off and reattach it? Like,
I wish.
So there's certain things where some people are just gifted. Maybe it's muscle fiber type. Maybe it's their tendon morphology. Maybe it's their nervous system. There's things that are just the way they are, and sports are not fair. Like at the end of the day, sports are inherently unfair because it's not fair that Usain Bolt is 6'5" and has the ability to sprint that he does, and we don't. But that's what makes sports cool, because someone wins, someone's better.
Yeah.
There's also the training side of it, which is, relates to those physical abilities. Physical abilities can be changed. Some of it is innate, but then there's some wiggle room with how much you can manipulate those physical qualities through training. So, like you said, those low-level ground contacts probably built up a lot of elasticity, which helped him run fast. There's also the skill side of the equation, which can also be an innate quality. So skill can be developed. It's taken me a long time to get to the point where I feel like my technique is like okay. In the past, I had a lot of trouble with it. So that can change. But there's also skill qualities that are innate, where some athletes are just better at directing force in the right direction into the ground, how they interact with the ground, how long they're on the ground. Like, there's some qualities like that they just have, where no matter what they do for training, they're always going to have that. And it's going to allow them to perform better even when their training is subpar, So some of it just comes down to, like, you could call it genetics, you could call it just who they are as an athlete. Some of those things are just the way that they're going to be. Now, we can't get stuck focusing on that, because it does me no good to think about, like, my Achilles tendon isn't as long as Noah Lyles is. Like, where's that going to get me? So I have to work with the type of athlete that I am, apply the stimulus that I can handle, both that I'm good at and that I can adapt to, work on my weaknesses a little bit, and then see what the results are, reassess, and try to continue on from there. But I think a lot of it does come down to the skill side. And they may not realize that they're doing it. Like, that's just how they run.
Mm-hmm.
But it just so happens that how they run is a more effective way to run. They may not have earned that through training. They just have that. That's how they're wired. So all we can do is try to improve our skill, execution, try to improve our physical qualities, and then at the end of the day, be grateful for whatever it is, the performance that we put out, because, you're faster than someone else. You go to meets, and there are people looking at you wishing that they were running the 400 as fast as you. Obviously, you want to run 47 and faster. So when you don't, it's frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important for us as athletes to approach competition training with, like, some amount of gratitude and appreciation for what we do have, because there's people who look at us and wish that they were as fast as us, just like we look at other athletes and wish, oh man, I wish I was running those times. And so as you go through the process of training, working on the physical qualities, working on the skill development, it's easy to look at what you've accomplished and be like, oh, but I could be better. Like, if you run a PR, the first thing you're thinking about is, how can I get to the next one? We need to take time to appreciate those moments and look at, like, what has my progression been? How much have I improved relative to my own performances? And look at that as, like, success, because there's always going to be someone out there who is just simply better. And there's no real reason from a training perspective of why they're better. They just are. And we have to accept that sometimes.
There's therapist Coach Bidlow coming out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So when it comes to coordination development, one of the most interesting things I've seen on it is the Reengineering Sue course on Altus. Have you watched through that?
Yeah.
Okay. Watching those athletes do those drills is just, like, mind-blowing. It was so smooth and so perfect. Yeah, it was crazy. And I think I've heard you talk about the dribble being one of your favorite, or ankling, or whatever you want to call it, drills for speed development. Have you well, I guess I know you've messed around with using, like, weight vests for different resistance and stuff while you're doing those, maybe ankle bracelets, and you use, like, the Exogen resistance. Do you have any tips when it comes to trying to develop coordination doing those things, especially as someone who is self-coached, and so I can't always see what I'm doing to know what to fix? Yeah,
that's tough. I don't have a great answer for you there, but if you're working with other athletes, that's where you can look at them and be like, okay, maybe they don't know how to, like, swing the leg back down toward the ground. So I need to do a drill where they're focusing on their knee and they're focusing on driving the knee down and back, which then brings the foot down. And we want to feel a little bit of a vertical lift when we hit the ground because that leg swing needs to lead to vertical force. So I'll pick a drill that works for that. With yourself, it's tough because there's a lot of like bias and it's just hard to coach yourself at the end of the day. Everyone who I've talked to who's coached themselves, it's tough. And that's why there's almost like no elite sprinters that have ever made it to a high level who didn't have a good coach, who were self-coached. Doesn't mean you can't improve self-coach, but you face other challenges. I think you can use certain tools like, say, the Exogen wearable resistance or a resisted sprint or a weight vest to work on changing what it feels like as you interact with the ground. So a lot of athletes, they don't quite have the right amount of like, when they're pushing an acceleration, they either push too long or not long enough. So if someone's tap dancing and not going anywhere, I probably want to put them on resisted sprints so they can feel that interaction with the ground more and they can have a greater kinesthetic awareness of the ground and they can feel the push more. And then when we go to the non-resisted sprint, I want them to feel that aggressive maximal push through, not just hit the ground, but through the ground. And that'll help transfer to them, applying force better in acceleration. If you have someone who maybe they're not super conscious of their leg swinging during the swing phase and they get into kind of wonky positions where maybe their leg's too extended or it's arcing up too high on the backside or something's happening, maybe that's where the wearable resistance is better. So you throw some calf sleeves on, throw a little weight on there. Now you can feel that leg swing more and you can then interact with that and kind of try to change it a little bit to, improve your technique. But technical changes, in my view, which relates to coordination, is a lot of just, you're trying to find a certain feeling that correlates with a certain movement. And if all you ever do is go to the track and repeat the same feeling, you're going to repeat the same motion. So you have to manipulate like the feeling you're trying to find. If someone is, I don't know, what's a good example? If someone is like super hunched over when they run, okay, I'm going to tell them, you need to run. If you're 6 feet tall, you need to run like you're 6'5". Feel like someone pulling your head up out of your body as you get up into top speed, taller, taller, taller. Those sorts of things can help too with like, maybe you're trying to look at like this athlete is, when they hit the ground, their leg bends too much or they're like too squatted when they run. So, all right, let's just try to get them to be taller, see if that changes it. But I don't know. It's a tough question to answer because if you're working with yourself and you can't see yourself running, and even when you look at your own film, it may be harder for you to assess your own technique than another athlete's technique. So I would just try to keep it really simple. Like, is my posture good? Am I hitting the ground in the right direction? Am I progressing my body angle as I accelerate? Once I'm at top speed, and my foot comes off the ground, is it stuck behind me and lagging, or does it arc back up and come through pretty quickly? When I go back to hit the ground, am I crashing into the ground, or am I setting it straight down under myself? I would try to keep it real simple for you or for anybody who's watching this who coaches themselves. Keep it really simple from your technical model. And then if you see something that is consistently an issue, then you try to look for the tool that will give you a greater physical awareness of that thing you're trying to manipulate, which could be the resisted sprint, could be the weight vest, it could be the wearable resistance, something like that. It's not a great answer, but that's the gist of it.
No, that was good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is one of the things I've noticed, for me at least, that makes the biggest difference is my pelvic positioning. I don't know if that's something you pay a lot of attention to with other athletes, but for me, I've found that it helps reduce excessive backswing on the leg. It helps fix where my foot contacts, like closer to underneath my hips. It helps improve my direction of force application. But even though I know all those things, if I don't do specific drills, so I'll talk about one in a second, but specific drills to actually teach me to put my pelvis in the right position, I can't do it. So like the last few weeks, I've realized I've been losing it without even noticing, because just trying to put it there doesn't work. But if I do something, are you familiar with Connor Harris?
No.
Okay, he's a biomechanist on YouTube. His stuff is insanely good, but he'll do stuff
Might have
like,
seen it but not know his name type of thing, so I'll look him up, check it out.
Sure. Yeah, but like you sit with your butt close to a wall, your feet or your ankle and knees at 90-degree angles against the wall, and you exhale all the way till you feel your obliques kick on gently. And then you contract the hamstrings gently to pick the tailbone just slightly up off the ground. And then you sit there and you do breathing, like 5 slow, deep breaths. And by doing that, it teaches the hamstrings and the obliques to fire at the same time, put you into that neutral pelvic position, and also is teaching your diaphragm how to function properly. I think that's probably one of the big things for me, but you feel the back of your rib cage stretch.
Right.
And it's like, oh, this is the feeling I need to be feeling while I'm standing up doing my drills. So anyway, that's something I've noticed. If I don't do that drill, I can't get my pelvis in the right spot. I'm curious, do you focus on the pelvis much and do drills like that?
So I definitely focus a lot on the pelvic, positioning and orientation. And that I kind of lump that in with posture. So when I say posture, I mean the spine and the pelvis. So your spinal posture needs to be good, but then your pelvis needs to not be tilted forward, tilted back, that sort of thing. Because like you said, the pelvis is going to dictate what your legs can do, because that's what they're attached to. So if your pelvis is tilted forward, as your leg swings to the front side, it's going to put a lot of stress on your hamstrings. You're probably going to pull a hamstring at some point. You're going to be more likely to have too much backside going on. You got to have backside mechanics, but you need to be within a range, depending on what event you're in, that is appropriate for the style of running that's appropriate for your event. So from an injury prevention standpoint and from a performance standpoint, pelvic positioning is huge. I've done things, it depends on the athlete. So some athletes, I'm just like, they're close enough, whatever. But athletes I had an athlete who had a lot of back pain, for example. And when he got tired, he would go into anterior tilt, his lumbar spine would be locked in, and it would just perpetuate these other injuries he had, plus hurt his back. So for him, we had to do things where he was becoming more aware of his pelvis, of his core muscles, of his glutes, and work on different exercises to get him used to what it feels like to be in the right position, and then try to bring that into sprinting. I don't have like specific go-to drills that I've used for that. It's more, I've just looked at like, okay, what is this guy doing wrong? All right, let's just get him in a position where now it's right. Okay, you feel the difference between this and this? Yes. Okay, now go sprint and try to maintain something close to this thing that you have now felt. So I think it can be really useful, and that's where drills can be really helpful, is to give you some context for what a certain movement should feel like or what a certain position should feel like. So then when you go do the sprint, where you don't have the time or the ability to really focus as much because everything's happening so fast, it's a little easier to bring that into it if you've done it in a more controlled environment. I've even done that myself, where like I find that my abs tend to be really relaxed and it makes me look fat to where my belly will be round. But like if I stand up in a certain way, tilt my pelvis to where it's really neutral, try to breathe a certain way, all of a sudden all the muscles in my lower abs and through my abs just go like this, and now I look super skinny and like every muscle is activated. Maybe there's something there that I need to work on, maybe there's some benefit I could have in my pelvic stability when I sprint. So I'll do things like that, to where I think if you can give yourself that context with the more simple exercise, it's easier to bring it into the more complex thing that is sprinting than if you were just to say, keep your pelvis neutral. Like, an athlete's going to look at you and be like, what the hell does that mean? I don't know what that means. So, and you can work on it in normal drills too. Like if I was, say we were doing warm-ups and they're doing like a high knee walk, I would tell them, okay, yeah, you want to bring your knee up, but you need to bring the knee up via hip range of motion, not by tilting your pelvis back. Sure enough, someone would bring their knee up by tilting their pelvis back, and I would say, okay, stop. Come back to this position. That's the highest you can go. Do you feel how if you go any higher you do this? That's you tilting your pelvis back. We need to avoid that, you know. So there's opportunities in all kinds of exercises, I think, to work on those things. And as a coach or an athlete, pelvic position is very crucial because that's the foundation upon which every stride occurs, because it's directly attached to the pelvis and nothing else.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think the glutes play a big role there. That's like, it's a Cal Dietz thing. I'm sure you know who Cal Dietz is. He always says brace the glutes, not the abs. I don't know if I necessarily fully agree with not the abs, but I mean, the obliques at least need to kick on. But yeah, flexing the glutes has had a big impact for me. And speaking of Cal Dietz, actually, are you a fan of triphasic training? Have you tried that a lot, or is that something you've sort of stayed away from?
That was like my first introduction into any program. So I got exposed to training through, there's a former strongman, Mark Philippi. He had a gym in Vegas called Philippi Sports Institute. And I went out there, learned a bit about training because I knew someone who was at UNLV playing football who he was training there. He was a family friend. So I went, trained with him for a while, learned a bit about training, came back, and then pretty much led the training of my, football and track team buddies and stuff throughout high school. Once I got out of high school, I took a year off, didn't really do anything. Then I decided I didn't want to waste time anymore and I wanted to get back into track. Immediately got hurt because I hadn't been training. Then I got super into training. And the first book that I got was Triphasic. I think it's great from the perspective of giving you a lot of foundational concepts like specificity and, like you apply a stimulus and you will adapt in the direction of that stimulus you apply. And there's certain things you need to consider if you want to get faster or stronger or more explosive. And then I did the program many times. I wouldn't do it now in the format that it's presented in the book, but there's still countless things in my training that are influenced by things I learned from that book. So I think if anybody hasn't read it and they haven't been exposed to a lot of training theory and all that, or even if you have, there's a lot to be gained from it. I just think that first of all, I don't think like block periodization is necessarily the best way to go, and that's a very block-oriented program. I also shy away from slow eccentrics most of the time. There's certain things I'll do slow eccentrics on, but like I'm not going to load up 600 pounds on my back and do like a 6-second squat. Like I just don't. I feel like it's just going to make me slower and make me sore and not give me anything. But I got strong as hell doing it. I'll tell you that. But as time goes on, you take things from, I've studied West Side. I've studied the Triphasic program. I've read the Zatsiorsky book. I've read all kinds of stuff. And over time, you just see what are like some of the consistent themes between these different ways of thinking. What is something unique I can pull from here that makes sense for my situation? What can I pull from there? And then you formulate your own version of how you train that applies best to, your situation, your constraints, and all that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's not a short-term high-performance strategy, for sure.
Right, yeah.
And I've been in a spot because I had these arbitrary goals I wanted to hit in my training before I moved on, where I stretched out a triphasic chunk for like months now. And it's definitely a waste of time, and I could be in a much better place than I am if I hadn't been trying to hit those arbitrary goals that didn't mean anything before I progressed.
Yep.
I've heard you talk, especially with Rolf Omen, quite a bit about accumulation versus intensification phases, and that's something that has confused me quite a bit because I've never like read about it in a book. I don't really understand what it is. So what's the difference between an accumulation and an intensification phase, and at what times are you doing those? Is that like all year round you're bouncing back and forth between the two, or is it like early season you're doing that but not while you're peaking, or vice versa?
I don't want to speak for Rolf, but in the conversations I've had with him, my take on it is that he does that year round. So just think of it as a way to shift between sort of more building up versus like building the engine versus tuning the computer type of thing. The accumulation phase you might be doing longer TPV exercises, especially early in the year, so maybe some slower, larger range of motion lifts, things like that. So you do that for 3 weeks. Then you go into an intensification phase. So you take the exercises you were doing and you intensify them. That could be via load, so they get heavier. It could be by reducing the range of motion so the reversal gets quicker and more intense. It becomes more reactive. Depending on the point in the year that you're at, how you intensify may be different. Early in your off season, maybe you're just intensifying by going from, you're doing sets of 3 or 4 on squats or cleans or something, and now you're doing like singles and doubles because you could do more weight. But then over time, the accumulation and intensification happens more in like the range of motion and the exercise selection from the perspective of how reactive or how snappy or how fast the exercise is. So it's just a way to bounce back and forth between sort of building up certain qualities versus trying to like intensify them as much as possible. Because if you just stick with intensification forever, like eventually the knife will get blunt and it's no longer going to do much for you. You got to change something in order to get the body to keep adapting. But like he would approach it like, you start with a box squat of a certain height in your first accumulation phase. And 4 phases later, the height that you're using of the box or the range of motion of range of motion of the lift. The range of motion of the lift as you progress through these phases is going to get smaller and smaller over time in both the accumulation and the intensification cycles. So what you used for intensification in your first cycle can become accumulation for the next cycle or a couple cycles later. So maybe you went from an 18-inch box squat to a 24-inch box squat. Now the 24-inch box squat is in your accumulation phase, and now you're going to a 30-inch box squat, so the range of motion's shorter. And then you go from the 30-inch to a drop squat where there's no box and it's a really small range of motion. It's just a way to conceptualize progressing the exercises toward intensification further and further, but without just doing like a linear, everything gets more intense the whole way. You kind of like intensify by changing the exercise or the range of motion. And then the next phase, you do more work than you did in the intensification cycle. In the accumulation cycle, you do more work. Maybe the intensity is a little lower than it was, but you're getting more reps and more volume and all that. And then now you intensify again by changing the range of motion or the exercise. That's the gist of it.
Okay.
I don't take that exact approach, but I still keep the general idea in mind of like, okay, if I've been focusing on max strength for like 6 weeks, I need to now shift to something that's more reactive. Otherwise, I'm going to adapt too much to the max strength and my force outputs are going to become something other than what I'm after. So I need to now intensify and make it more reactive. Okay, now I've done that for 3 or 6 weeks. I should probably go back to something more max strength oriented, but the max strength exercise I choose to do in December is not going to be the same one that I chose in August because I'm closer to the season. So maybe max strength was back squats. Then it became an 18-inch box squat. Then it became a 24-inch box squat. Then it became a high handle hex bar deadlift pull or something. So you're still working on like a quality like max strength, but the exercise is shifted more toward the less time under tension, more rapid type of movement, even though we're still using it as a strength stimulus. That's how I would think about like accumulation cycle 1 versus accumulation cycle 5. We're still trying to work on max strength in both, but the grinding large range of motion exercise we used in phase 1 is not the one we're going to use in phase 5 because we don't want to disrupt our sprinting and all that. We just want to, everything needs to shift more and more toward the demands of the track, but you can still bounce back and forth between like a building phase and a firing on all cylinders phase, That's how I would think about accumulation and intensification.
Okay, so you wouldn't necessarily do his framework where he's doing like 2 weeks accumulation, 1 week deload, 2 weeks intensification, 1 week deload. Do you tend to do longer blocks? Am I understanding that right?
my training isn't super organized. So
Oh,
I would
okay.
say that like most of my training is very auto-regulated, and I mostly have a set. It's sort of like the damn path rollover approach of like, I have X number of things I want to work on, and I'm going to cycle through those over time. As I see my times or my whatever data I'm tracking, I see how that then relates to the data I'm seeing based on what I did. And I may still cycle through those same things, or I'll change them slightly. So maybe originally I was doing back squats, power cleans, I don't know, some other exercises. Over time, I'm going to shift toward things that are faster or more explosive or short duration rate of force development stuff. But I may cycle back into something that's a little bit heavier if I feel like my max strength has suffered and I've moved away from that too much. Or I focus too much on max strength. I need to bring in some reactive work, so I'll cycle that in. And I just sort of continue to go through these different qualities I'm trying to develop. And then I just make adjustments over time based on, am I getting the results I want? You know, I don't really plan out like far in advance. I basically line out, okay, I got 10 days where I need to get X number of things in. So I'm going to try to fit those in based on what I think I can do best on any given day. Some days I don't feel like loading up a heavy bar and doing heavy strength work. So like, I'm not going to do it that day. I'll hit it at some point in this 10-day period, but it's not today because I don't have it. Or I feel great. I feel like I could lift a whole house. So I'm going to do that on that day because I feel like it's most appropriate for me. It's not the best way to train someone else, but I'm pretty in tune with my body at this point to where I can just cycle through those different qualities I'm trying to touch on and just manipulate the proportion of that work based on how much of an emphasis I'm placing on it at any given time.
Okay.
That applies to the track or the gym equally.
Mm-hmm. So does that mean generally you won't schedule a deload? It's just like maybe if you're feeling extra tired or your metrics are going down, then you'll put one in?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Take an extra day off. If aches and pains are creeping up on me, all right, that's a sign. I got to look at what have I done in the last week or two? What do I think is causing that pain? All right, I'm going to pull that out or reduce the amount of the program that it takes up. So I'm pretty fluid with how it's set up. I just have those main goals, and I want to make sure I hit all those main goals within a certain period of time.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's not doing that is a mistake I've definitely been making toward the beginning of this year. Like I was mentioning with my triphasic stuff getting pulled out over too long of a period, I was like, there was a certain volume I wanted to hit on the track, and then that was going to be the end of phase one, and then I'd move on. And it just doesn't make any sense. Like it wasn't relevant. It wasn't something that I needed to focus on, and I did anyway. And now I've been dealing with Achilles tendinopathy and all my times were dropping, partly probably because of pain, partly probably because of systemic fatigue. But I'm trying to smarten up a little bit. So this week has been a very gentle deload, and I'm going to carefully ease into things and take them 1 week at a time moving forward for sure.
Well, I think it's just hard to you can't predict the future, and every program I've ever written has changed. So instead of wasting a bunch of time planning out to the T what I'm going to do, I just know the general progression I want to have over the next couple months or something. Like I know where I'm trying to get to. I know where I am now. So I can sort of plan out roughly how that's going to go. But there's always something that gets in the way. And, say you have a speed session, you show up to the track and it's like the wind is in the wrong direction and you walked at work too much, so something's bugging you, and okay, well, that session is not great for that day. Let's push it back a day. Or I had a certain session planned, but I'm not recovered, so I need an extra day off. I just kind of play it by ear in that regard. And then when I'm ready to go, I know that I'm going to do one of a few sessions, and I'll do the one that makes the most sense for me on that day, what I'm most motivated to do. And seems to be working okay. For some people, it's a little too chaotic, but for me, it works.
I bet it makes training pretty enjoyable too, because then you're not forcing yourself through stuff you really don't feel like doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So when it comes to your velocity-based training stuff, How would you approach doing that if you didn't have something like an E-node sensor? Like I'm planning on incorporating that stuff pretty soon now. And what I'm going to do is probably just look at those charts that you've put out on your channel and use those as a reference point for what might match up to early acceleration, what might match up to late, and like change my training based on that. Is that the approach you would take as well?
Most of the time with velocity, like with the sensors that I use in my training, I'm looking at time to peak velocity, so the duration that the bar is accelerating during a movement until it reaches peak velocity, how long that is. And if I'm trying to have it be more acceleration oriented, then I'm going to pair up that TPV with the ground contact times that I see in block clearance or step 1 or something like that. So typically you're on the blocks, or I am, for 350 milliseconds. So if I do something where it's a heavy movement and the TPV is 350 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds, I assume that that's roughly close enough to the demands of that it'll help, or at least not hurt, that portion of the sprint. If I'm trying to have the gym session be a little bit more relevant to like late acceleration or max velocity, then I'm looking at like 90, 80, 70 milliseconds of time to peak velocity, and I'm trying to target that. Now, if you don't have a sensor, it's more about like how snappy does the lift feel? You know, how quickly do you get in and out of the bottom position of the lift? How much of a grind does it feel like? Like if it feels like a grind, you're probably at like 900 milliseconds of time to peak velocity. Great for max strength. Probably not great for speed. If you do something like those drop squats that I've showed where I like barely move at all, it's just like ba-ba, ba-ba. That's like 70, 80, 90 milliseconds. So that's like the far end of that spectrum. If you look at the box squats where I've said I'm at like 300 milliseconds, you can just sort of look at it and get a feel for how long the rep takes, how quickly am I able to accelerate off the box, and just try to find exercises that allow you to do that. Like a clean, for me, a power clean is usually 600 milliseconds. Hang clean might be 250 to 350 milliseconds. A 4-inch step up is 120 to 150 milliseconds. A 12-inch step up is like 200 to 250 milliseconds. So if you can, if you have a sensor, it makes it a lot easier, because then you just pair that with what part of the race are you trying to impact? And then you think about, okay, do I need more of an eccentric aspect to this? Like, is it the velocity on the way down and the quickness of the reversal that I need? Is it just the concentric push that I need, maybe for the block start? And you kind of pair that stuff together. But without a way to track the data, it's pretty hard to do. So you just sort of have to be like, okay, this is very reactive. This is like sort of reactive. This is pretty heavy, and this is super heavy. If it's super heavy, it's max strength. If it's pretty heavy, it's probably relevant to the start. If it's somewhat reactive, think acceleration. If it's very reactive, think max velocity. And then see what happens after a period of time doing that, focusing on any one of those or a couple of them, and see what happens. I focused a lot on I would say 150 to 300 milliseconds with a little bit of 600 to 900 millisecond stuff, and my acceleration improved, but my speed didn't. So now I'm really trying to get 70, 80, 90 milliseconds in on a lot of exercises to see if that impacts my top speed at all. And we'll see, but it was interesting to see my acceleration get better as I was working in TPV durations that were pretty close to the ground contact times of acceleration. Mm-hmm. Which kind of reinforces my belief that there's something to it.
Yeah, for sure. That's what I'm going to be targeting toward in this next little chunk of training as well. My early acceleration, I'm sure you've seen enough of my videos to know it's atrocious. And,
I would say the 350 millisecond range is probably going to be good for you.
Okay. Makes sense. I will aim toward that for sure then. I just got a sled, so I could start doing sled training again. Mm-hmm. And so I think to start, I'm going to go for a pretty heavy weight around velocity decrement of like 50%, mm-hmm. but just for like the first little chunk, and then I'll probably drop down to like 20 and then 10.
Yeah. I've had pretty good success with like a 10% velocity decrement, but I was already pretty strong going into it, you know?
Yeah.
So that plays a role. I think if you spend too much time in the really significant velocity decrement zones, it just becomes something other than sprinting. It's more just like a strength exercise for your calves and that sort of thing. You can use it for feeling like pushing in a certain angle or that sort of thing, but if you really want it to like have any chance of direct transfer to acceleration, that's where I would say shift to those like 10 to 20% ranges, and spend most of your time there. But I think it's pretty useful to start heavy, get used to it. Maybe you'll get a little strength stimulus out of it, but then don't be afraid to drop the load and have it be pretty light. So that way your mechanics and the way that the acceleration progresses is relevant enough to where you could get some transfer between that and the unresisted condition.
Okay, for sure. Yeah. That's what I figure it might transfer to like first step, maybe second. And I'm cool with that because my first step's rough. So like, yeah,
well, and that's
for a starting point.
The greatest amount of acceleration happens on the first step.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what I've been able to see that with the resisted sprint thing I have is I can see, and that's what you would expect too, but like it proves it. The biggest jump in acceleration is the block clearance. And then it's like kind of flattens out, you know? So improving that first step is key. Part of that is going to be strength. Part of that is going to be block setup. Part of that is how you push into the blocks, you know? But then you also have to, clearing the blocks fast is great, but then you have to be in a position that is sustainable for the rest of acceleration. So you got to keep it in the context of the whole thing, of course.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever experimented with doing 2 times per day training stuff? I know I was listening, I think it was your podcast with Rolf. He's pretty big on the 2 times per day. And of course he's working with elite athletes. That's all they're doing. So I know that makes a difference, but it's something that's confusing for me as someone, especially who's always heard like do a high day, then do a low day, then do a high day. It's like, I struggle to understand how you would, if it's even worth trying to do. And if it is, how you'd incorporate those things. Where I am right now is I'm thinking it makes sense to do like a little mobility session in the morning, just so you're not all stuck and glued up like an old man, and then just go out and hit it hard later in the day. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I would definitely lean toward what you just said. It goes back to what I was saying about how like you only have so much time, energy, and ability to handle stress in your day. Physical stress, mental stress, whatever. So you have to go with the natural ebbs and flows of your body. And I think if you try to consistently do multiple sessions per day, you'll either get burnt out or hurt at a certain point. It's one thing if you have like a lot of support available to you. With the Chinese national team, you know, I don't know. How often is WADA showing up? I don't know. I really don't know. I'm ignorant. But those are questions that I have when I see someone doing 12 training sessions in a week, you know, because I know myself, I couldn't do that unless my training session was go sprint one sprint and then go do like a couple sets at the gym or something like that, or one sprint in the morning, one sprint at night. I'm sure I could do that, but then it's a time factor, you know? How much time does it take for you to get to the track, warm up, do your workout, go home, eat, shower? You've eaten up a bunch of time.
Mm-hmm.
That takes away from the rest of your life. To be successful as a post-collegiate athlete, you have to think long term. It's one season is not going to make or break you unless you like explode and tear your Achilles or something. So I would rather focus on a consistent, like I would rather train well 52 weeks out of the year than have a killer 3-month period and then I get hurt, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather stretch it out over time and just consistently be churning good sessions out. The only times where I would say the 2 sessions daily pretty often thing will work is, like I said, if your facilities are like one and the same, your track and your gym are at the same location, then it's much more feasible because it's basically the same workout at that point. Or if you're a pro athlete or you're like super rich and you don't have to work, then it makes sense because you can just revolve your whole life around it. But for most people with a normal life, I just don't know how they do it, you know? Recovery aside, like just from a time perspective, I don't know how you can fit it all into your day without feeling like you're rushing around and just like spread thin, and I don't know. So I definitely lean toward most of the time do one session per day, and then periodically when you feel really motivated and you have the time for it and you know you have time to recover, then do a 2-a-day session, because that's a little bit more stress. You'll probably create a bigger adaptation. But your program doesn't have to be like set in stone to where I train once a day or I train twice a day. Most of the time train once a day and sometimes train twice per day. Like that's totally fine. You don't have to stick to one specific thing as far as the structure of your training.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense with stuff I've felt with my training as well. One of the places I feel it might be most useful is sometimes, especially if there's a 2-day weekend, I noticed in college that people would come back for who knows what specific reasons and be a little flat or not be able to sprint very quickly.
Of course.
And and even sometimes when they weren't going out and doing all kinds of crazy stuff, that would happen. And so I feel like maybe from a perspective of potentiation, it might be a useful thing to do. Like when I would do med ball throws for workouts, if I went and played volleyball 3 or 4 hours later, I would notice I'd jump way higher than normal
for sure,
from that potentiation. And so I wonder if like once a week doing a little potentiation session in the morning that's like 20 or 30 minutes long, and then just coming back later that day and hitting a hard workout, I wonder if that'd be a good thing to try.
Yeah, I think that's totally fine. It's just, I wouldn't look at it like I'm trying to do 2 adaptation-oriented sessions in a day regularly. But if it's do a little bit of a warm-up in mobility work or a little warm-up in some med ball throws or some, like what, Matthias on YouTube, Matthias Hove Johansson, he had a lot of days where he would go and do like, jump rope and mobility work and some banded jumps or things like that before his session later. That's great because you're waking up your body, you're, checking in with yourself, making sure you're good to go. And when you get to that second session, you're going to feel much better. That, I think, is really useful. It's just when people are like, I need to do 2 big workouts in a day, that's the thing that I think is unsustainable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when it comes to the whole potentiation thing, there's something I've noticed. So, like, when I have a meet coming up, I get super nervous, like badly nervous for days going up to it. And like the day of, I'll almost feel sick and like I don't want to talk to anybody and it's just rough. And I don't know if it's that or the training, but for whatever reason, I show up on meet day and I feel like limp. I'm like a noodle. Like there's no muscle tone. Yeah. I'm just like floppy. And I go to sprint and stuff and there's just like, there's nothing there. I don't know if you've experienced that with yourself or with your athletes. And if you have, what kind of things you can do to combat it?
I've had that when I like take too much caffeine and don't eat enough. Okay. I went to a meet and I can handle a lot of caffeine normally, but this day I ate like nothing. It was one of my first meets after not competing in a long time, so I was kind of nervous. And I took 300 milligrams of caffeine and I felt like trash. Like I could do that right now and I'd feel like, I'm fine, chilling, Yeah. But that day, it hit me like a brick to the face and I felt super weak. There was just nothing in my system, So I think whether it's due to having too much caffeine and not enough food or just the general nerves of competing, it can definitely, like, once again, there's a bell curve of how stimulated you are, how like the mental arousal type of idea. There's a point at which you peak, and then anything more than that, you're going to go downhill. So whether that's how much importance you're placing on the meet and your performance, which is causing you to be anxious, there's some amount that may help, and too much is going to hurt you. Some amount of caffeine is going to help, too much is going to hurt you. So as you go into meets, I think it's important to like really be introspective about like, why are you nervous, or why are you anxious about your performance or the meet or whatever? You know, are you afraid of failing? Are you afraid that what you've been doing is, you know, not going to work, or that you're going to do the wrong thing? Or in the past, I would have meets where I'd go and it's like I get in the blocks and it's like I've never sprinted before. I all of a sudden don't know how to move properly. It's taken a lot of time to get away from that. And a lot of that, like one reason why I talk about being grateful and like appreciating the fact that you're at a meet is because it helps kind of take away some of that like threat mechanism that goes off in your head when you could think about like, well, what if I don't run fast? What if I don't achieve my goals? What if I run poorly? Whatever it is. If you show up to a meet and you're just happy that you're there and you're thankful you're able to run and you're like, wow, this is cool. Like, it's a beautiful day outside. I get to do something I enjoy. I'm here because I enjoy doing this. You can be much more free to run without the anxiety. Whereas if it's all about the performance, anything other than that preconceived notion of the performance you want to achieve, anything other than that is like a failure. So then you're like, I don't want to fail. And then it creates this mental thing. So for anyone who deals with anxiety and gets to meets and feels flat or feels like there's just nothing there when normally they feel fine at practice, I would think about just appreciating that you're there and really trying to enjoy. Because if you don't enjoy what you're doing, then why do you do it? You know, if you're not getting paid the big bucks to go out and run, then you better be doing it because it's fun and because you like to do it. So if you actively and consciously set the mindset of, I'm doing this because I enjoy it, I'm here, I enjoy being here, this is cool, I'm around people who have similar interests, all that, you can take a little bit of pressure off yourself, because ultimately, like, it doesn't matter whether you run 49 one day or 47. You prefer to run 47, but nobody's going to like come cut your head off or shoot you if you don't do that. So you have to tone down the like concept that there's any risk or any threat, and just focus on the positive side of things of like, I'm here because I want to be here, because I enjoy being here. This is an opportunity to do something I enjoy. It's a beautiful day. I'm grateful to be here. Let's go have some fun. You'll still have the nerves and the butterflies because you're about to do something that's exhilarating. But it can be exhilarating in a positive way, not in a way that causes like a fear response within yourself. And I dealt with that a lot throughout my whole life. So I'm not preachy in a like, oh, you need to do this better. It's like, no, I've been there. I've done that my whole life. And only in the past few years have I been able to release that, Now, do I think potentiation is real? I think there's something to be said for, first of all, the warm-up effect. If you go do a little session in the morning, your body's going to be more warmed up after that. And even though it'll cool down in between the sessions, you stimulated it, it's going to be more warmed up than it otherwise would have been throughout the day, and that's going to help. I don't know if there is a unique potentiation effect that we can separate from the warm-up effect, but I do think there's something to be said for like waking your system up so that way you don't feel flat later in the day. Whether that carries through from one day to the next, I don't know, because I've had times where I do something on day one, I do something on day two, and I feel great on day two. I've had times where that doesn't happen. My PR I ran after 4 days of not even looking at a track. Like, I did absolutely nothing. I competed on Sunday. I competed on Friday. Did nothing in between. And I PR'd on that Friday. Had I told myself I need to be potentiated, because if I take days off, I'm going to be flat because this coach told me that that's what happens, I probably would have been flat because of the story I told myself. But instead, I was just like, I needed to recover, and I look forward to this meet. So once I get to the meet, I'm going to go run as fast as I can, and whatever it is what it'll be. And I PR'd, So I don't think that there's like hard and fast rules of, you have to do potentiation or not, or you have to do something the day before this because of this concept of you're not going to be activated enough. Just like I don't think there's anything wrong with if you have a meet at night, yeah, go do a warm up in the morning and just like get your system going. Don't go blast a bunch of fast sprints, but like get your body woken up. So then when you go later, you don't have to spend 2 hours warming up because you're all stiff because you're laying around all day. I think there's value there. But if you don't do that, I don't think you're losing anything specifically, like unless you tell yourself you are. Because once you tell yourself you are, that's probably the reality that you'll end up with.
Mm-hmm. So when you were talking about the positivity stuff, you were talking about your body sensing threat. And that made me think of some stuff that Chris Corfist and Dan Fichter talk about. I'm sure you know those names.
Yep.
They're big on like training drops and stuff, so your body knows it can handle certain forces. And they say things like, you can't expect your body to let you jump 40 inches if it doesn't think it can land from 40 inches and that kind of thing. Do you think... Oh, and like balance. Like if you don't feel balanced on one leg, your body might not let you output the most force possible on one leg. Is that something you're thinking about at all when you're programming?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ideas out there for sure. How many of those ideas are reflected in like hard realities, just like the potentiation thing, is up for debate. I do think inhibition is a huge factor in like a lot of the adaptations we're after are reducing inhibition. Like you're physically capable of handling more tension than you've ever been exposed to in a lift or in a sprint or whatever. Your body doesn't let you go there because it doesn't want to get hurt. Part of the training process is convincing our body that we're able to put out X amount of effort or intensity or limb speeds or whatever. So I do think you need to consider, you don't need to consider it necessarily, but I think that's a part of the training process. So it could be something that's valuable to consider. Whether that means you need to drop off of a high box and whether that's going to help you or not, I don't know about that. It may not. It may hurt you. It may make you better. Like it really depends. But in general, inhibition is huge, especially if you've been injured. Like if you come back from an injury, the biggest problem you deal with as a result of that, at least for me, is not the pain, but the inhibition that is caused by the pain. I can't put as much force through the ground if I have an injury in the back of my mind because my brain doesn't want to get hurt again. So how do I overcome that inhibition? That's probably the most important part of the injury recovery process once the tissue is healed, is getting away from that inhibition and getting to a point where the body does not have the speed governor, turned up all the way. That's like one reason why plyometrics became a popular thing, is because we want to, get the Golgi tendon organs to not resist putting out, high levels of tension. It's like, so I think you do need to have that as a concept in your mind. How you apply it, though, is really up to you. Do you do it with weights? Do you do it with jumps? Do you just do it with sprints? Do you do it with, I don't know. That's a whole different question, I would say.
So you brought up plyometrics. I actually wanted to ask about that. How do you think about programming plyometrics without getting in the way of the speed work?
The first thing is you have to look at the athlete that you're dealing with and assess, is this person a gazelle or are they a water buffalo? Because even though water buffalo are pretty explosive, maybe an elephant would be a better example. But the gazelle, they can bounce their way, from here to Timbuktu and no warm up and they're fine. The elephant, probably not so much. So if you have an athlete who is super bulky, likes to lift a lot, they may not be the best candidate to do like a whole lot of intensive plyos with. The athlete who hates lifting, but is bouncy as all get out, they're probably the better candidate to do more plyometric loading. It doesn't mean you never lift that person and you never do plyos with the other person, but the intensity of those plyos, how much you do, how complex they are, needs to be applied relative to the person who's doing them. if you have a 250-pound lineman or linebacker, linemen are probably like 350. You know, he probably can't do as much as like the 150-pound triple jumper, you know, so you would train him differently. The other thing to consider is the adaptations that you're going to get out of plyos are going to be limited by someone's skill execution. So if you want to do bounding and you want to get an adaptation out of bounding, but you suck at bounding, so the intensities are not high because the coordination isn't there and you just can't do them well, you're probably not going to get much of an adaptation out of that. So you need to pair the plyos with like the skill level of the athlete as well as their body type. And then from there, you can decide if you want to go further down that route or not. I haven't been jumping very much at all, and I see like no difference in my times. So I use the lifts more as my plyos, and I'll do some hopping, some bounding, some things, but I find if I do too much, it just beats me up, and I'd rather save that to let sprinting beat me up and not add more with plyos that maybe are not, like, I can't say with a high degree of certainty that like if I get better at bounding, I'm going to run any faster.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm not certain on that, but I am certain that if I do too much of them, it's going to beat me up, I probably don't want to do as much of that, you know, or if it's someone who can handle it really well and they have no problems, then yeah, do it. Like, great. That's generally how I think about plyos.
Yeah, for sure. I think I'd probably fall into a similar boat as the one that you're in, or I've had rough tendons like my entire athletic career.
Yep.
Probably because I started as a distance runner and I loved my coaches, but they had no clue what they were doing and they wrecked me for years. And ever since then, I've just had really rough tendons. But it's like, as someone who's suffering with Achilles tendonitis right now, the likelihood of me going out and doing a drop jump and surviving is like, it's pretty low.
Yeah, that's like the last thing you need to be doing right now.
Yeah.
And also, I think this is an important point that, you know, you want to use the weapon in battle that is most appropriate for where you're at in that battle, you know? So, like, small arms fire is probably more appropriate early in a conflict than a nuke, you know? A nuke is like, there's no coming back from it. Same thing kind of applies to what you do in training. If you can get by with, like, just getting generally stronger in sprinting, just do that. Then once you see you're stagnating, you think, okay, what can I modify? You don't go straight to the, 6-foot depth drop, because where do you go from there?
Mm-hmm.
An 8-foot depth drop? That's not going to work, you know?
Yeah.
So as we move, we want to intensify over time. The more training years you have, the more you need to intensify further and further until there's no getting better because you're too old or you're too beaten up or whatever. We don't want to jump from, if we have a scale of 1 to 10, we don't want to jump from 1 to 10 very quickly because we can't go anywhere from there. We can't progress anywhere from there. So when it comes to plyos, start with low intensity plyos. Do line hops back and forth. Do like very low amplitude stuff. Anybody can do that, pretty much, and be fine. As long as like it's progressed gradually and you don't jump straight into like 500 contacts day one. If you're sane with the amount of work you do, do a few sets of 10 line hops. Okay, great. Over time, that can turn into something more intense. But a lot of where people go wrong is just like skipping some steps along the way and like going to the most intense thing and then having nowhere to go from there. And I think that's really relevant with plyometrics.
Yeah, it makes
it's
a lot
like
of
going
sense
straight
to
to maxing before you've gotten used to the exercise,
Yeah. Do you do 1 rep maxes ever?
I would say most of my training is like maximal in some way, but I never get to like I don't think I've ever gotten to like a true, not ever, but not in recent years have I gotten to a true 1 rep max. Like last year I did a heavy single on back squat. I did 443, but but I wasn't in like a power rack or anything. Like I was just standing on a Olympic lifting platform, and I didn't want to get hurt. So I was like, okay, I'll just stop here. But I probably could have done like 475 that day because 443 moved really well. That 505 box squat, I probably could have done at least another 20 or 30 pounds, maybe done like 545. But I didn't feel like the juice was worth the squeeze. So I work up to heavy singles all the time when I'm doing heavy work, but I try not to go to like a true max just because I don't know if I'm going to gain anything beyond like, if I'm at 90%, am I really going to gain anything by going to 100%? Maybe, but the cost is too high, so I'd rather not.
Mm-hmm. So with having a squat that's so far beyond like a 2 times body weight squat, which doesn't even matter, but that's like the arbitrary metric people like to throw around. Mm-hmm. Do you think you'd be at a better place right now if you, over the course of your career, had spent less focus on max strength development? For the record, that's not a judgment. I'm just genuinely curious what you think.
No worries. I've thought about it, but I go back to like the concept of what are you good at and what makes you unique as an athlete. And I benched 315 as a junior in high school. So strength is something that comes naturally to me. Maybe that, I don't know. I've never had to do like as much work to get to the strength levels that I get to than other people. Like other people have to do more volume to get, say, to a similar relative strength level. I just think that if something makes you unique as an athlete, you don't want to stray from that. It doesn't mean you spam it to the point where like that's all you do, but you have to work on weaknesses and things like that. But if you neglect your strength, then that takes away like your trump card, so to speak, you know? That like, if I am naturally strong and it's easy for me to get strong and I can recover from lifting very easily, like I could go do box squats and go sprint the next day. Be okay. I may not run as fast as I otherwise would, but like physically, I don't get super beat up by it unless some weird thing happens. So as a form of intense loading, that works for me. Now, if I do too much of that, because I'm good at adapting to strength work, I'm going to adapt too far to the strength side of things and maybe I'll get slower. So that's where I have to rein it in, is like, what proportion of my program is taken up by that work? How much energy and time am I dedicating to it? That's why I may do a heavy lift like once every 10 days at this point. Stay in touch with it, but I'm just working up to one heavy single and that's it. I'm not doing like 6 sets of 3 at 85%, you know? It's just I build up to a heavy set, do the heavy set, all right, I'm done. I've tapped into my max strength. I know it's there. And as long as it's there, I'm good. I don't need to like hammer at it. But I think if I never did any strength work, I might be giving away one of the things that makes me a better athlete than I otherwise would be. Now, maybe that's just cope because I can't go back in time and change things. But like, I've just always been more strong than I am like bouncy, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I feel like I got to maintain that.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like that makes a lot of sense. It's like, I don't know, generally speaking, if it matters much if someone's like an elastic or power focused athlete, but like it definitely makes a lot of sense in your case. And it's clear that you tend toward that direction. I can't, benching 315 is crazy, but I definitely don't have the upper body blessings that you do, but I think I tend to be a little more of a strength dominant athlete as well. I'm not, no one would look at me doing anything and be like, oh, that's a bouncy guy. It's just not the case.
Right.
But I build strength pretty easily in the lower body, and I was stronger than a lot of guys who would jump way higher, or like the one guy I talked about, sprint faster than I would.
And that's why because I'll have people come on and ask me, which is a totally fair question, like, why are you doing these lifts when you could just be doing more plyos? Well, first of all, the like plyometric lifts that I do it's not a real term, but we'll make it a term. The like plyo type lifts that I do where it's really snappy and just like pop, like what I posted yesterday on Instagram. I can manipulate the loading very specifically. Like I can choose the range of motion. I can choose whether it's 2 feet, 1 foot, staggered stance, whatever. The type of weight I'm using, whether it's mass, bands, whatever. I can manipulate the loading condition specifically to what I'm trying to achieve. Whether that results in me getting better is a different question, but like I can choose the loading conditions very particularly with lifts. I can handle lifts fairly well. So I would rather do that for the bulk of my plyometric stimulus than go do exercises I'm not very good at that tend to aggravate my body just because that's like more of the traditional route. You know what I mean? Whereas for someone else, like I have a pretty strong back, so I can handle like a lot of axial loading. If someone has a weak back, doing those fast drop squats is super intense, like for your spine. So I probably wouldn't do that. I'd probably have them just lift slower and do the really rapid, bouncy stuff on the track, plyos, those sorts of things with someone who's more of like the skinny, elastic type of athlete. So it's just one of those things where for myself, I try to pair what I know is going to, or that I think is going to give me some benefit at a lower cost, and just try to like have that be my focus, because I've had years where I did all kinds of jumping and it just aggravated stuff for me. I love to jump. I'm pretty good at jumping. Like I can jump high. But 2 foot jumps is what I'm good at. I'm not good at 1 foot jumps. Am I going to get faster doing a bunch of 2 foot jumps? I don't know. Taking them out, I haven't had any issues. So I'm just going to keep on with kind of what I've been doing, you know. Even though it is a little biased toward the strength side, I think I've been able to modify the lifting to where I kind of scratch the lifting itch, but it's rapid enough and low enough time under tension that it's not going to give me the negative effects of doing too much grinding, heavy strength work, while still occasionally doing the heavy work just to make sure that I still have like the motor unit recruitment and all that sort of thing.
When you're in the weight room doing the faster time to peak velocity stuff, so like I did a lot of those toward the end of last year. Like I would do heavy step ups. Obviously I reduced the weight eventually, but like heavy step ups on 1 or 2 bumper plates. Yep. And then I had a squat machine that I would use bands and weight on. So it's like the best I could do to simulate a Kaiser squat with no great equipment. And doing that stuff, you hear that it's supposed to be a really high central nervous system load, but like I never felt tired afterward. Like I felt really explosive, and I feel like even the next day it would transfer out into my performance on the track. Do you have any like frame of reference for that? Like, do you need to be careful when you're doing the fast stuff and worry about your nervous system, or does it not really matter?
Probably comes back to like a dosing question, you know. If you do too much of anything, you'll be fried. But I've found that it's much easier to recover from the short range of motion stuff. I think the part of the reason is just there's less time under tension, and then there's less muscular breakdown, because you're more just like bouncing out of a position rather than having all those muscle fibers get like yanked apart and like they would normally in a heavy strength lift. So I found that I'm able to recover very well from that stuff. Like today I feel pretty good, and yesterday I was doing like the shortest time to peak velocity stuff I could possibly come up with. And in the past, I found that to be the case. And Rolf said that he's seen the same thing, where you can recover pretty fast from this stuff. So I think a lot of the fatigue that we deal with is really, I know people say nervous system fatigue, but I think a lot of it is just local and systemic muscular fatigue. That like, whether it's a buildup of calcium ions or whatever's going on, a lot of the fatigue that we deal with that we say is nervous system fatigue is just like a general muscular fatigue that is going to be greater if the time under tension and the length of each rep and all that is higher. So when you do these things where the rep takes like a quarter of a second and you're basically just like stretching everything like a rubber band and snapping back from it, there's not as much muscle tissue breakdown. And I think that is one reason why you don't feel super fatigued after, because there's just not a lot of breakdown happening. That brings up the point of you're not going to get a lot of muscular adaptation from like a hypertrophy perspective. So if you have like small glutes and you need bigger glutes because a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, and for some athletes that's what they need, you're going to have to do the full range of motion, heavy strength work, or at least do some accessories that tap into that, because you're not going to get that actual muscular development from these snappier types of exercises. What you're getting is like the wiring and the elasticity. So if you have enough muscle, and getting more muscle is not going to do anything for you, you're going to get probably more out of doing this stuff. If you have no muscle at all, you're not going to get much out of it doing this stuff. So that's where you maybe need to do more of the traditional strength training type of stuff, So it goes back to like knowing what you're up against with the athlete you're dealing with. Do they just need to become more muscular? Great, that's simple. Do they need to have a more efficiently wired nervous system and be able to use elastic tissues more effectively through like how co-contraction works and all this stuff? All right, that's a harder problem to solve. One way we might try to solve that problem is with these types of exercises.
That makes a lot of sense. I've never heard someone explain it like that. I always hear people going on about the central nervous system, and so that's always sort of the focus of what I'm thinking about. But now that you're saying that, it's like when you first start doing a new type of training and you adapt really fast, everyone knows it's neural adaptation, it's not physical, like right out the gate. And so it's kind of ridiculous to assume that every time you do a hard or fast workout, your nervous system will be fried, when that's the thing that is adapting faster than anything else in your body.
Right. Yeah, you might just have like a bunch of muscular damage going on, which when you sprint fast, you get sore, a lot of tension, also a lot of metabolic, waste being built up and stuff like that. Like, you probably just have like your tissues are just fried.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you're doing your really fast time to peak velocity stuff, do you pay attention to if the movement has a stretch shortening cycle or not? I know there's like sort of one involved in everything, but for example, with a step up, in my head, you're not loaded into the turnaround stage. So it's not like you're loaded through an eccentric, then an isometric, then a concentric. It's just like you sort of slam down, it's sort of straight into a concentric, as opposed to the Kaiser squat or something simulating that, where you've got that fast eccentric. Do you pay any attention to that in your training? Do you think it's relevant?
I try to do more stuff with like the rapid eccentric loading, just because I think that's what I need to get better at. With a low box step up or something, if you were to zoom in on the ankle, you would see there is a moment where the calves do get stretched, the Achilles gets stretched. It's just very brief, and there's not like a huge length change, but you can see that it's kind of like the slack is being taken out, and once that slack is taken out, which I'm sure there's like a micro eccentric contraction going on, then you go up. So I do think there's still something going on there, but I do more drop squats and staggered stance drop squats and things like that, because I just feel like that's where I probably need to get better. I'm good with like concentric stuff. I could go do a 500-pound step up and great, but like, how fast can I get in and out of the bottom of the position at a joint range of motion that is similar to top speed sprinting? I feel like that's where I can maybe make up some gaps on people who are faster than me.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And if I was concerned about a step up, I could just start at the top of the step up and go down and then back up.
True.
It might be slightly more eccentric. So
yeah,
that makes sense. I guess I'll go on to one more thing, and then I want to be respectful of your time. I know this has been a while, so we'll probably call it after that.
I'm good on time, but my throat is cooked from talking.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, so do you pay any attention to, well, I guess I'm going back to the nervous system already, but nervous system regulation? So things like doing deep breathing after an exercise session, or breathing before bed to help calm yourself down to sleep better. Do you pay any attention to that and do that with your athletes at all?
In the past, I did stuff like that a lot. Over time, I probably, focus less and less on like little details like that, just because between work and family and like it's hard for me to stay consistent on little things. I'm much more consistent with like the big things, like the big workouts, But I think it's valuable for sure to like tune into that stuff, especially for like if you are experiencing some nervousness around competitions, like deep breathing and like you can really calm yourself with that stuff. So I think being in tune with that on a regular basis is good. I also think that we're so stimulated all day from screens and, you know, chugging energy drinks and whatever, that there needs to be some period of your day where you land the plane intentionally and you bring yourself back down to base level. So I'll do like foam rolling and stretching at night, or sometimes I'll just like lay on the floor and veg out, but like I'm still doing something that is bringing my system down, so that way when I go lay in bed, I'm already in a state where I can fall asleep quickly as opposed to laying there for a long time. So I do think it's valuable to find opportunities in your day to lower the overall tone of your system, and calm yourself, you know?
Yeah.
It's just, I think it's just a wise practice in general, just for your like sanity, but also for recovering and getting into being able to sleep more effectively and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's huge for quality of sleep. I've experienced that at least. There was a time, you know the book Oxygen Advantage? I'm sure you've heard of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was getting into that for a while, and the CO2 tolerance and that kind of stuff. And there was one day I did super slow, deep breathing, so slow that I felt I had the air hunger constantly the whole time. So it's basically like a CO2 tolerance exercise, but I literally did it for like an hour straight before bed, which is ridiculous. But I laid down to go to sleep, and I couldn't sleep because I had like classes the next day or something, as in like I only had 6.5 hours or something, which for me is terrible. I need like 9 or I feel bad. And it was the best quality sleep I've ever had. I slept so well. And I was like, dude, if I could do this every night, I would be a different beast.
Right? Yeah. No, I totally think that there are things that you can do that cost no money, that only take a little bit of time and, you know, discipline to do regularly, that can benefit you, you know, whether that's the breathing stuff, checking in on your self-talk, you know, taking notes of how your session went or how your training's been going and reflecting on that, seeing, I did really well during this period of time. What was I doing before that? You know, that maybe led to how I was doing then. And how does that relate to where I'm at now? Or there's little things that you can do over time that aren't a workout, that aren't in a specific, you know, stressful thing that can benefit you. And I think deep breathing and paying attention to that is really wise, because you can build those skills of like being in tune with that. And then if you're at a meet and you feel like you're getting a little too revved up, maybe you do just sit down for a second and deep breathe, and oh, now I feel more calm, and now I can get back into my warm up, you know, and you can sense that happening and stop it before the cup overflows, you know? So definitely on board with doing that type of thing. And when I was coaching Santa Barbara City College, we would do like a pre-session like meditation minute. And then with the high schoolers, I would do something like that after the session, where we'd do a little like some light stretching, nothing crazy. But then I might have them just lay there for a minute and just kind of just breathe, relax. And they always seemed a little bit more chilled out afterwards, and, you know, kind of a good vibe just to do that stuff. So I'm all about it. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. And if anyone wants to learn more about the self-talk stuff, Dr. Joe Dispenza, I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's huge on that kind of stuff. It's really interesting. The idea that every single thought we're having is firing certain neurons, and we could be like building literal disease into our bodies. But
yeah, no, it's
anyway,
crazy. There's all kinds of rabbit holes you can go down, but I think you can, I find that in sprinting specifically, there's a lot of people who deal with these issues like we have both experienced. And so I see sprinting as a way to like get some personal development and like work on our mindset, because like, for example, my day job is construction project management, where there's like tens of millions of dollars on the line based on whether we do things right or not. it's very easy to let that stress you out. But in the moment, as something's going on, I can like keep myself kind of grounded. And a lot of that is a result of skills that I've developed through track, by keeping myself grounded when it's like time to perform and the pressure's on and whatever. So as you go through training, whoever's listening to this, and you deal with anxieties or fears or disappointments or whatever, you can have that moment where you feel it, but then as long as you can try to like learn from it and learn about yourself and what got you to that point and how you got out of it, you can then develop skills that will last you a lifetime, even when you're no longer competing and, training as an athlete. So, performance is important. We want to perform better, but there's also things we're gaining from doing this track thing that can benefit us outside of track. And so, I just suggest that everybody, take that opportunity to learn more about themselves as they go through the training process. And you might find that over time, it becomes easier to deal with things outside of track because of the lessons you learned on the track.
Yeah, that's awesome. Dude, thank you so much for coming on. This was great.
For sure, man.